From the WKYT studios in Lexington, this is Kentucky Newsmakers with Bill Bryant.
Good morning from WKYT News. Hope you're enjoying your Memorial Day weekend. A cliffhanger in Kentucky's Republican primary for governor. There is an 83-vote margin. Matt Bevin leads, but James Comer is seeking a recanvass, and that will apparently happen later in the month. The turnout exceeded projections slightly at about 12.5%. What does a recanvass mean? Is that the final step, or could there be a more involved recount? Secretary of State Allison Lundergan-Grimes is Kentucky's chief elections official, and she is joining us to talk about that. Let's put those results up, Secretary Grimes, before we get into this discussion and show folks just how close this vote is. 33% for Matt Bevin, 33% for James Comer, an 83-vote difference. What is the situation?
Well, it's Kentucky in May. There's not only just one horse race with the Derby and the Preakness that we're looking at, but obviously here in our Republican gubernatorial primary, we have a vote difference now of 83 votes between Matt Bevin and Commissioner of Agriculture Jamie Comer. And the next step in the process, it's truly up to the candidates or slate of candidates. As of this morning, Wednesday morning, my office still has not received any request from any candidate or slate of candidates requesting a recanvass. It's not required that they do that. There is no margin which automatically indicates whether a recanvass would occur or perhaps a recount, nor is it required that a recanvass occur before a recount. It's just typically what candidates, especially in races as close as this across the state, would do, because a recanvass, it's free, it doesn't cost the candidates, as a recount does, any potential bond, and importantly, the law is set forth already as to when it would occur.
Well, we anticipate by the time we air this that will have been received, because James Comer says that he is going to have the totals rechecked. What does a recanvass really mean? You know, everybody throws the term recount around, but a recanvass means exactly what?
A recanvass is a verification of the vote totals as they were taken from the machine and then put on a recap sheet that was then submitted last night. All totals up until the State Board of Elections, with which I chair, on June 8th convene, all totals that we are looking at right now are unofficial vote totals. So it would be an examination, the scope of which to be determined by the candidate. It could be a precinct within a county, it could be entire county, or it could be all 120 counties. It would be conducted May 28th. That is set by statute. It occurs on the Thursday following the election and is done by the County Board of Elections in the specific county or counties within which a candidate requests, starting at 9 a.m. in the morning on May 28th.
Is it relatively a quick process?
Well, we have had recanvasses in the past. Since I've been Secretary of State, we have had 5 recanvasses, 3 of them in legislative races, 2 in judicial races, and those returns came back expeditiously, as is required by statute, to the Office of Secretary of State within that very same day. So it's one that our office is prepared for. Our clerks also prepared. We actually advise them at the beginning of the month, not only providing them with the documentation as to what they would need to report their unofficial results on election night, but in the event that a recanvass or a recount is requested, the necessary paperwork that they would need.
How often does a recanvass change the result?
Well, in the recanvasses that I have been a part of as Secretary of State, they did not alter any of the vote totals. But, for instance, in 2011, Republican nomination for Secretary of State Hilda Legg requested a recanvass against Bill Johnson, and it did change the vote total slightly, 6 votes, but it didn't alter the ultimate nomination that was certified by the State Board of Elections. 2007, a statewide race for treasurer with Lonnie Napier. So recanvasses have occurred in the past, and again, our county boards of elections, the Office of Secretary of State, and the State Board of Elections, we are all well prepared and stand ready to make sure that the voters, and especially the candidates that are on the ballot, can have the confidence that they should have in our elections and the integrity of them.
You know, if you're talking 83 votes, I mean, if there is a digit off, or, you know, if there is supposed to have been another digit, I mean, how could a mistake, how simple is it to have potentially made a mistake in reporting those vote totals?
Well, this will come as no surprise to especially the viewers, but imagine having a business that opens twice a year, as do our elections. We have over 3,700 precincts, 15,000 workers, precinct election officers. They all are trained. Yesterday it was a long day. We gavelled in at 6 a.m. at the State Board of Elections, and we're there well past midnight. And it was a great day from our perspective as an election administrator. Things did heat up in the race. We did happen to have a fire at one of our polling locations, but the first responders, they were there, machines secured, voting continued, no voters were disenfranchised. And as with any business, you would expect errors. And here, there is possible human error, and that's what this recanvass would help to check for, basically taking of the vote totals on the machines down to paper as they are transcribed.
All right, we've kept it on the recanvass because that's what we anticipate is likely to happen here. But there is a next step, and that would be a recount. What does that require? And that is, the cost of that is borne by the candidate, right?
A recount is a procedure that is wholly within the jurisdiction of the circuit court. In this instance, because this is a statewide election, it would be the Franklin Circuit Court. And in contrast with actually filing a written request with my office, it's a petition that would be filed by a candidate or slate of candidates with the Franklin Circuit Court. The judge oversees the entire process, and importantly, why it's not often the first procedure that a candidate goes to, it's because there's cost that's required, a bond that is required to be put up by the candidate to account for the cost that it requires the county clerk and especially a vendor to go through in re-examining our ballots. And in contrast to a recanvass, a recount is what the name implies. You are a manual recount of the ballots that are at issue in the election.
Now that sounds like something that takes much longer.
Again, the time and the manner with which it's conducted, it would be set by a judge. Ultimately, as the calendar exists now, unless a judge says otherwise, the State Board of Elections is set to convene to actually issue certificates of nomination, making the results official. People throw around the term nominee all the time, but right now everyone is just presumptive nominees. There are no official results. The State Board of Elections would come together June 8th to make all results official and issue certificates of nomination.
Have we ever had a recanvass in the gubernatorial primary, I mean, in recent years?
We are checking our archives right now for that. Believe it or not, we have had recounts before. When it came to a congressional race back in 1994, a recount occurred in Susan Stokes versus Congressman Mike Ward's race. Recanvasses, we have had statewide recanvasses, as I mentioned, from 2007, statewide treasurer's race, 2011 statewide Secretary of State race, all on the Republican nomination side.
I know the Republicans also had very close gubernatorial primaries in 1967 between Cook and Nunn, in 91
yes.
between Forgy and Hopkins, but I don't think those went to that point with the recanvass. All right, once this is all settled and you move on, then into the fall elections, nonpartisan candidates can still file in August, right?
We will be having filing deadlines approaching and making obviously all eligible and interested individuals aware of those deadlines.
But they have to have indicated if they're going to spend money that they're running, right?
That is
Unless
correct.
It's their own money?
Yeah, well, there are filings that you do make with the Registry of Election Finance, and obviously that paperwork all available online. You can go to elect.ky.gov.
Congratulations on your renomination. You considered other races. I know you looked at the governor's race and the attorney general. Are you pleased with seeking re-election to Secretary of State?
I'm honored to be the nominee again for the Democratic Party as Secretary of State. I was so humbled back in 2011 to be overwhelmingly elected. It's not often you lead your ticket, as we did back in 2011. And the record that I'm running on is one of success. As we're talking about here today, you may start out in elections in a partisan manner, but in the office of Secretary of State, you take that hat off. And I serve at the pleasure of all eligible Kentuckians, looking out for not just Democrats, but Republicans and independents to make sure we're not only improving our business climate, but importantly, when it comes to elections, that we are protecting the integrity of the process, ensuring that we're breaking down the barriers to that ballot box.
All right, Secretary of State Allison Lundgren-Grimes, thanks for being with us.
Thank
we
you very
appreciate
much.
it. We hope you'll stay with us on WKYT's Kentucky Newsmakers as we look at this important election year. Back in a moment. Welcome back to Kentucky Newsmakers here on WKYT. This has been an interesting week in Kentucky politics, and it looks as though that will be stretching into next week at least with the Republican recanvass. Some other contests are settled. It appears there will be some spirited races ahead in the fall. Dr. Joe Gerstensen teaches government and politics at Eastern Kentucky University. He's been following Kentucky races closely for several years now. We'll talk about the fall campaign and about next year when Senator Rand Paul intends to run for re-election and for the presidency at the same time, a caucus for the first time in Kentucky in many, many years. Dr. Gerstensen joining us. Thanks for coming in. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks for having me.
First, let's hear quickly from Democrat Jack Conway and Republican Matt Bevin, who spoke on election night.
I'm chomping at the bit. I'm ready to go. I'm ready to engage because this is important. This is important stuff. I mean, the governor of Kentucky controls a huge budget that invests in elementary and secondary education, higher education, invests in workforce development.
I am calling out to you tonight to join us in this effort because we are indeed Kentucky, and we have much work to accomplish, but with your help, we're going to make it happen. If you love Kentucky, we ask you to come on board because we are Kentucky.
As we know, James Comer has requested a recanvass, and that is set to happen next Thursday. Joe, we expected it to be close, but a cliffhanger like this on the Republican side was unimaginable. Does the eventual winner of this come out of this hurt or helped by what's going on?
Well, I think that there's potential for either to happen, but ultimately I think that this is a good thing for the Republicans. The fact that you had three candidates very competitive in this race, that it drew so much attention, perhaps some of that negative, but it still generated interest. Republican turnout significantly higher than on the Democratic side. You actually had more Republicans at the polls statewide election day than you did Democrats, and that's unheard of in Kentucky politics. I think that this demonstrates the growing strength of the Republican Party in Kentucky and this competitiveness in statewide elections that is really becoming more pronounced now. And so I think that the eventual nominee, whether that be Bevin or Comer, goes into the general election pretty well situated.
Secretary Grimes was talking about the fact that there will be this recanvass next week and that it rarely changes the outcome of an election. So if Comer goes ahead next week and eventually concedes, does how he goes about clearing the scene determine if he has a political future?
I think so. I think that no one in the Republican Party, barring perhaps some very ardent Comer supporters, would want him to request a recount and take that additional step. I think that there will be some sentiment that if the recanvass doesn't change anything, that Comer goes ahead and bows out, and then the unity rally goes forward on the 30th, and the Republicans coalesce. I think that if Comer were to, request a recount and to really prolong this, that would create some harder feelings over the long run.
It's often said that the person who spends the most wins, and that is the most likely scenario in the United States right now. But Hal Heiner spent more than $4 million of his own and carried only 9 counties. Money did not buy him success in this primary.
No, it didn't. And, money helps, unquestionably. But you had Comer, who had already won statewide election in Kentucky, was known to the voters, went into the election with that name recognition and general approval for the job he's done as agriculture commissioner. You had Matt Bevin, who ran against Senator Paul in the primary and so had gotten that statewide recognition there.
Senator McConnell, last year, right?
I'm sorry.
Right.
And you have Hal Heiner, who hadn't competed statewide to the same extent. So yes, has that money, but hadn't been out there in front of the statewide electorate the same way. And so I think that played a major role. And then also, of course, the tone of the campaign and some of the negativity that was associated with Heiner, even though, perhaps he wasn't personally responsible for that negativity, I think unquestionably hurt him.
Does Matt Bevin's challenge to Mitch McConnell, who is now the majority leader of the U.S. Senate last year in that primary, cause trouble for Republicans going forward? Does McConnell, he has said he'll support the nominee of the Republican Party. Will he enthusiastically support someone who did not endorse him after last year's primary?
I don't know how enthusiastic the support will be. I take Senator McConnell at his word that he will come out and support the Republican nominee, even if that is Bevin, who did challenge the senator for the Republican primary, and who wasn't willing then to offer his support to Senator McConnell for the general election. Are there still some hard feelings there? I have no doubt. But I think that Senator McConnell will not do anything to hurt Bevin's chances if Bevin is the nominee.
So how do you see the fall campaign lining up now with Democrat Jack Conway, who had an easy walk to the Democratic nomination, and potentially Matt Bevin as the Republican nominee? How do these two line up?
Well, I think early indications are that this should be a tight race. And I would envision it being very competitive as we move forward. Conway, say in contrast to Secretary of State Grimes running in the Senate election last year, he doesn't have to be on the ballot with any national offices, Senate, U.S. House elections. And so perhaps he's able to distance himself from the national Democrats a little bit more easily. And he will campaign in terms of, I'm filing a suit against the EPA and really try to create that distance between himself and President Obama and the administration. I think that if you look at Bevin, he's still going to try to tie Conway to the national Democrats. And then, Bevin will, I think, have to spend some of his time really broadening that appeal within the Republican Party because, again, as we were mentioning, he's coming off the heels of a fairly divisive primary, and everybody has said, we'll support the nominee, but he will have to spend some time and effort at least working on that.
Republicans, as we've noted, have made tremendous strides in this state and hold both of the U.S. Senate seats and 5 of the 6 House seats in Washington and control the state Senate. But the governorship has been very elusive for them. The Republicans, the Democrats have held the governorship for 40 of the last 44 years. Why is that such a tough race for them?
That's interesting, and certainly I think the first and foremost thing that we can point to, at least in recent history, is the timing of the elections. And so, as I was just saying with Conway, he's got to be thrilled to death that we don't have a presidential election or congressional elections on the ballot. And so that has really helped Democrats be able to make it an issue, a race that's about the state and not being linked to the National Democratic Party the same way. The Republicans, as with a lot of southern states in general, this increasing strength of the Republicans has really been a top-down phenomenon, and it's still working its way in Kentucky. But I think at this point the Republicans are competitive even in statewide races, and I would anticipate if it is Matt Bevin that he'll be right there.
How involved do you anticipate Democratic Governor Steve Beshear to be in this race? He is popular by all of the polling, has majority approval. He, of course, also has his son, Andy Beshear, running for Attorney General. Will he be very concerned about protecting his legacy, if not the programs that he has put in place, such as the expansion of Medicaid and Connect?
Well, I certainly think he has an interest in seeing Connect, Medicaid expansion remain in place and securing that legacy. On the other hand, I don't think he's going to be, front and center in this campaign. And I think, having his son running for Attorney General probably as part of that makes him more hesitant to really be out in front of the cameras. And, will he raise some money? Probably. but I don't think he'll be very high profile.
Thematically, going into this fall campaign, how do the Republicans and Democrats have to paint Kentucky? Do the Republicans need to paint a more troubled picture of the future, while Democrats can say that, you know, they want to keep some things in place? Or, you know, how do you see this fall shaking out in terms of those broad themes?
Well, thematically, I think the Republicans don't have to paint it as a troubled Kentucky now, but I think they will talk about potential troubles. If the Medicaid expansion continues, what types of implications does that have for the state budget? And, you know, as some more of the the responsibility for funding that shifts to the state away from the federal government, what does that mean? Can we sustain the health care system and Obamacare? So I think the Republicans won't say, gee, Kentucky's hurting now. It's a bit of a difficult case to make, but they can say, hey, gee, if these democratic programs remain in place moving forward, it's going to be trouble for the state. And certainly, I think that there will be an emphasis, you know, tying this race to directions of the national Democrats again, because it's hard to say, gee, Governor Beshear didn't do a good job. We know that Governor Beshear's ratings have been high, his approval ratings. And so the Republicans, I think, have to make it more national and say, looking ahead, here are the problems.
We know that there will be independent candidates who have until August to file, including Drew Curtis, who runs a national website. Gatewood Galbraith often spiced up Kentucky races. Could an independent with money, which Gatewood Galbraith really never was much of a fundraiser, but if Curtis, who potentially could go through that website and get some sort of national following, could come up with some money, could he make it interesting?
Certainly make it interesting. Could he be competitive? Could he win? I don't think there's any chance of that. But you don't need to win to make the race interesting, especially if you're talking about a competitive election. Then it's, you know, who are we siphoning voters from, and you know, which of the major party candidates benefits, who's hurt, and it could certainly change the dynamics.
And it might be hard to say with a technologically based candidate. You know.
Unquestionably, yeah. I mean, people can say, "Oh, here's how it's going to play out." I mean, I don't think anybody knows at this point how that would work.
We're with Joe Gerstensen, EKU Professor of Government. We're back in a moment. We'll talk about 2016. It'll be here before you know it, and Rand Paul's run for the presidency and for re-election. Coming up on Kentucky Newsmakers. Welcome back into Kentucky Newsmakers on WKYT, continuing our discussion with Joe Gerstensen, Professor of Government at Eastern Kentucky University. Next year could be very interesting in Kentucky when Rand Paul is running for re-election to his Senate seat at the same time he's running for the White House, and he had to kind of thread the needle to get to that point, and that included holding a caucus next year, which the Republicans have all but approved for next March. Won't that be interesting?
It certainly will. That, you know, for Kentucky voters, you know, I don't know how you couldn't be excited about the prospect of having a caucus. I was talking with my students on campus, and you know, I don't care what party you currently are registered. You should be registered Republican come time for that, so you can participate in the caucus. It may be your only opportunity
to see what it's like.
Exactly.
Well, what is it? What are they like?
Well, you know, there are variations, and I think that's important to note. And it's unclear exactly the format that the Kentucky caucus would take. But essentially, they're meetings. They're meetings of registered voters with that party. Typically starting at the precinct level and getting together and trying to convince one another to support a given candidate.
How do you think Rand Paul's presidential campaign is going early on?
Well, I think that it's going fine. I mean, it's becoming a very crowded field on the Republican side. And so I think it's a little bit early to try to handicap this at this point, but I think Senator Paul is positioned, you know, in a reasonable state right now.
Senator Mitch McConnell will no doubt be trying to protect the Republican majority in the Senate next year when Republicans hold most of the seats that are up for grabs.
Right.
And of course, that would determine whether he continues as majority leader. How tough will that challenge be for him? And would you think he's somewhat concerned that this Kentucky seat could be in play if Paul is distracted by his presidential run?
Well, I think that certainly maintaining majority status in the Senate will be Senator McConnell's first and foremost priority in 2016. As you noted, there are some concerns for the Republicans, in contrast to 2014, where the Democrats really had kind of the seats up for grabs and potential losses there. 2016 kind of flips the situation, and Republicans do have more seats that are up for re-election. You have a presidential election on the ballot, so we'll have to see who those presidential nominees are, because that can certainly have ramifications for those Senate races. In terms of in Kentucky, yeah, the Senator Paul situation makes for a potentially interesting Senate race here. You know, what happens if he is the presidential nominee? And then I think Senator McConnell would be at least somewhat concerned, although I think, you know, regardless of those presidential nominees, Republicans are likely to carry the state in the presidential election.
Of course, the problem next year is the law apparently says that if he were to come off of the ticket, because that is, if Paul became the presidential nominee, the Republicans can't replace someone on the ballot for the fall. So
right.
It would be handed to a Democrat next year, right?
Right. Well, you know, I think that how this plays out legally, and I'm not an election law expert, but I think that there will be suits before all said and done on this. You know, of course, if you look at the presidential race, is Senator Paul's name even on there or on the ballot? Or, I mean, we vote for electors.
Right.
We don't vote for the candidate. So, you know, how does this play out?
Lots of questions. All right, Joe Gerstensen, thank you for coming. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us for this edition of Kentucky Newsmakers. We'll see you bright and early this week on WKYT. This morning we start at 4:30. Have a good week ahead.